a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host. You should know who I am. I think I know who I am. For those of you wondering, yes, this is Cow and Chicken. Squid are irritable because they don't have any coffee to drink. If they do try, seawater gets into the cup and it makes the coffee taste funny. If you don't like weird tasting coffee, you need to go to Organic Man Coffee Trike and taste the real thing. 4501 McPherson is home of the best coffee in the universe. Don't take my word for it. Swing by today or visit organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Your taste buds will thank you. No cephalopod mollusks are allowed in the coffee shop. The Kraken legend can be traced back to Scandinavian seafarers, particularly Norse sailors who navigated the treacherous water of the North Atlantic. The first detailed description of the Kraken appears in Nordic sagas and medieval manuscripts, where the creature is depicted as an enormous sea monster that lurked off the coast of Norway and Greenland. For hundreds of years, men returned from the sea with stories of huge tentacles plucking men from the ship or grasping the sides and trying to drag the boat under. The kraken has been compared to other sea monsters from different mythologies, such as the Greek Scylla or the Charybdis, who also threatened sailors and ships. The kraken had a unique place in Scandinavian folklore as it represented the powers and the mystery of the ocean. The kraken was also believed to have a connection to the god Loki, who was known for being a mischievous trickster. As writing was introduced, scholars began recording these stories. The first known written account of the kraken comes from the works of King Sverre of Norway in the 12th century. In this early description, the kraken is mentioned as a gigantic sea creature capable of pulling ships down into the ocean. 13th century Icelandic text, the Konungsskagja. Oh, why can't folks all speak English? I know. The Tower of Babel, that's why. The English name would be the equivalent of the King's Mirror, which was a Norwegian educational text from the 13th century, describing massive sea creatures capable of creating dangerous whirlpools simply by submerging suddenly. In the 18th century, Norwegian bishop Eric Pontoppidan popularized the kraken legend in his book, The Natural History of Norway, written in 1752, that portrayed it as a monstrous cephalopod. This was not a work of fiction. It was the story about an enormous sea monster that the folks out at sea had to run into, and the folks wishing to go to sea should be aware of. Some scholars suggest the kraken legends may have been inspired by encounters with giant squid, which can grow over 60 feet long, according to some folks, and even longer, according to others. Two things you need if you're a giant squid: really cold water and really deep water. You'll find both in the North Atlantic. As people began to get smart, at least they thought they were getting smart, they began to look at these stories as just superstitious nonsense. It's easy to sit in an office and ridicule those who actually go out to sea and, well, see things. It's another one of those English things that I don't understand. You've got the sea, and you can see the sea. They are over they're over there with their things. For years, whales have been found with huge round scars, some as big around as a dinner plate, usually around their mouths. These scars must have come from giant squid. The whale finds squid to be tasty morsels and they try to eat them. Squid find being eaten by whales to be somewhat disturbing, so they fight back. Aren't you glad you don't have to fight your dinner to eat it? As whalers were killing their prey and hauling the bodies on board, they would see these scars and wonder what could have caused them. The boys in the white lab coat tend to say this was some kind of a parasite, like ringworm or something. Or maybe it was the result of running into something on the bottom of the ocean. Well, yeah, something like a giant squid. A giant squid is the spaghetti of the whale menu, a spaghetti that fights back. Think about that next time you're at Olive Garden. Anytime a bunch of fishermen brought in a tentacle they may have chopped off while trying to survive, the science nerds would say it was just something else, anything but a giant sea monster. When giant squid washed ashore, the remains would be whisked away and then denied. Why so much effort went into disproving something that was real makes me wonder about a lot of the other creatures these smart people tell us don't actually exist. Tales of giant squid have been common among mariners since ancient times, but the animals were long considered just myths and legends, and they were often associated with the kraken of Nordic legends. The giant squid did not gain scientific acceptance until specimens became available to zoologists in the second half of the 19th century, beginning with the formal naming of Architeuthis ducks by Japetus Stenstrup in 1857. Uh, from a fragment found in the Bahamian material collected 2 years earlier. That name got my tongue all twisted. Even then, some scientists did not accept the giant squid as being real. They didn't see it, so therefore it didn't exist. In 2006, a female giant squid attacked bait that was suspended beneath a Japanese research vessel off the coast of Japan in the Ogasawara Islands. The images were taken when the research team pulled the 24-foot squid to the surface and videotaped her. Why does my cat always want to attack my phone line? Only when I'm on. It was the first time a giant squid was filmed while alive. In 2012, researchers were able to capture video of a living giant squid in its natural habitat. 2023, a diving instructor, Yasuki Tanaka, and his wife Miki, while swimming off the coast of Toyuka, captured footage showing an absolutely massive creature swimming underwater. My question is, why didn't they immediately surface and get out of that water? Because that squid was a lot bigger than they were. Why do all of the scientists who say there's no such thing as insert cryptid here, suddenly they all claim that they knew about this giant creature all the time? It's as if they were all waiting for the right person to say, yes, it's true, before they would jump on board. It was like that scene in The Phantom of Paradise. The juicy fruits are on stage playing, and they come to the end of the song. Instead of applause, everybody turns to look at Swan. He slowly claps his hands, and the audience erupts in clapping and applause for the juicy fruits, simply because Swan told them it was okay. Scientists are like that. Did the high and mighty science guy decide that, yes, giant squid do exist, you can acknowledge them now? Now that we know that they're real, it gives veracity to the stories from years past. Unlike Bigfoot, they do have a body. Actually, they have a whole lot of bodies. Originally laid down in 1757, the 90-gun Impetu, she was renamed the Via de Paris in 1762 in recognition of her construction being paid for by the city of Paris as part of the Deuce de Courcelles campaign to solicit donations for the Navy from the cities and provinces of France. She was completed in 1764, just too late to participate in the 7 Years' War, but it was placed in the reserve. Ville de Paris was one of the first three-decker warships to be completed by the French Navy since the 1720s. In 1778, on the French entry into the American Revolution, she was formally commissioned at Brest and assigned as the flagship of Admiral Guichen. In July, she saw one of her first actions fighting in the indecisive Battle of Auchinleck. The French ship participated in the American War of Independence. She sailed in the company of 9 other ships when she was attacked by several giant squid and dragged down to the deep. There are several sites that tell about the demise of the Paris, and a lot more they say it sank in a storm. However, many other sites that I visited said that this ship was attacked by giant tentacled creatures that the sailors all recognized as being sea monsters. Maybe what they were referring to was a storm of tentacles. My throat's acting up. Not enough coffee. Sailors working on a ship near St. Ilona Island and Cape Niagara were attacked by a giant squid. Two of the men were pulled into the deep, and the third, who managed to hold on to the ship's railing, later died from injuries sustained during the attack. One of the squid's arms, severed during the attack, was 25 feet long. The full arm was estimated to be 33 feet. Based on this, the entire animal could have been over 60 feet long. In 1874, there was a report of an Indian newspaper telling about a squid encounter. On May 10th, a ship called the Strathowan was leaving Colombo for Madras through the Bay of Bengal. In the distance, a small sailboat could be seen, which had some kind of an unknown disturbance in the water around it. The water was being churned up, and the crew of the small vessel were screaming and attempting to ward off some kind of an attack. As the crew of the ship watched, a huge squid pulled itself up on to the small boat. The men on the Strathowan fired a cannon at the giant squid, but it seemed to have little effect. The smaller vessel began to sink from the creature's weight. The crew of the small boat were forced into the water, and not a good place to be if you've got a giant cephalopod nearby, and they were eventually picked up by the crew of the Strathowan. The captain of the small boat, James Flowood, reported the small ship had been named the Pearl. No, not the Black Pearl, just the Pearl, weighing in at 150 tons. Two sailors died in the squid's arms, and a third disappeared and is presumed drowned or eaten. Five people escaped the Pearl. The squid's body was said to be at least as thick as a small ship, with arms that were as thick as wooden beams. Think railroad ties. In 1930s, the Norwegian tanker Brunswick reported having been attacked by a giant squid in the South Pacific between Hawaii and Samoa. The animal tried unsuccessfully to grip the ship with its tentacles before it was killed by the propellers. The story was validated by Commander Arne Groningsheider of the Royal Norwegian Navy, stating that the ship had not one, but three encounters with giant squid between 1930 and 1933. I wonder what was about this one ship that was attracting these giant creatures. Was it something the crew was throwing overboard, or maybe it was the color of the paint? Maybe it was something in the paint. They should find out what was on that ship and stop using it. In the 1940s, Britain was a week away from starving to death. Everything had to be brought in by ship, and the Nazis had decided to interfere with any and all shipping. To disrupt shipping, there were auxiliary cruisers. They looked like cargo ships, and they flew the flags of any country but Germany. They would try to capture or sink supplies en route to the British Isles. The most feared and dangerous item in the ocean was the wolf pack. U-boats would converge on shipping lanes and sink anything they spotted. To combat these attacks, the Allies came up with the concept of the convoy. Looks like we got us a convoy here. Yes, that's a trucking song. U-boats would simply sit and wait for the sailing vessels to come to them. In order to get around these submarines, the authorities came up with the idea of the convoy. 40 to 60 ships would all sail together, with warships mixed in for protection. Fighters and bombers would escort the ships until they were too far from shore, and then more planes would try to join the convoy as it neared Britain. At night, the ships would travel in total darkness. No lights were allowed. The ships all had to maintain their headings and speed in order to not run into each other, which did happen. Any U-boat trying to attack the convoy would have to get past the destroyer escorts and then find targets in the dark. It worked, seeing as Britain did survive the war. If a ship was torpedoed, the convoy would keep going. The men on the sinking ship had to drop their life rafts off the side and then jump overboard. Once in the freezing water of the North Atlantic, they had to swim to one of the life rafts. Some of these rafts were simply huge wooden structures, 10 feet by 10 feet, and getting up onto one could be tricky with cold hands and hardly anything to hang on to. The plan, if you want to call it that, was for the last destroyer in the convoy to find these men in the dark with no light to help and rescue them. If the destroyer fired up their searchlights, it would give a U-boat an easy target. Many times the men on the life raft had to spend the night, even up to a week, drifting around hoping and praying that a ship might find them. There were rudimentary supplies on board, a small barrel of water that was rather old and stale, and some dry stale bread. No coffee and no dry clothing. No coffee. How barbaric. The United States, which wasn't in the war yet, wink, wink, we were in the war, only the war hadn't been declared yet. The U.S. began building Liberty ships, basically a hull with an engine. Our ability to build ships faster than the Nazis could sink them helped win the war. It wasn't until Germany bombed Pearl Harbor. Oh, come on, you must have seen Animal House. It wasn't until Japan bombed Pearl Harbor that the U.S. got even busier building war machines. Yes, John Belushi said Germany bombed Pearl Harbor. As a convoy was being put together, secrecy was the name of the game. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people in the U.S. that wanted to see the bad guys win, just like today. As ships were loaded and joined up into a convoy, there was always somebody watching who would pass this information on to the Germans. The dates of each convoy were set to coincide with the new moon. Keep the night as dark as possible. Daytime wasn't as dangerous because the sailors could spot periscopes and torpedoes before death arrived. Sailing in a convoy was about as safe as standing in the middle of a highway during rush hour traffic. You might survive, you might not. I couldn't find the date, but I do have a report on one such unlucky ship. One of the many books behind me which are in desperate need of sorting. I've actually read most of them. There was a British cargo ship manned by sailors who were more concerned about their families' well-being than their own. The ship set sail along with about 50 other ships, all hoping to see Britain and not Davy Jones' locker. In the middle of the night, a huge explosion rocked the ship. Fire rose into the night sky, illuminating the ocean, making all the other ships scatter to avoid the burning oil and possible U-boats still on the prowl. Men ran to the life rafts, dropped them into the water below, and then jumped into the bizarre, fire-lit ocean. 10 of them managed to scramble aboard one of these little wooden floating devices, and then they began looking for the destroyer. I will give the man in charge the name Lieutenant Gregory. Sounds kind of British to me, and I can't find the story in the book, so I can't reread it. As the oil fires burned out, no rescue came. It was now pitch black, cold, and very lonely. Nothing to do but sit and wait. The sun came up, and the sun went down, with no sign of anyone coming to get them. Lieutenant Gregory did his best to keep the morale up, but there's only so much you can do on a 10 by 10 floating piece of wood. The following morning, the lieutenant noticed he only had 8 men with him. Nobody had any idea might have happened to the 10th man on the life raft. He must have fallen overboard in his sleep. Wouldn't he have yelled out? Perhaps he did, but they didn't hear him, all being deep in their own dreams. To make sure that no more men were lost, a watch was set. One man would stay awake to keep an eye on the others. Staying awake with nothing to do but count the stars can be a royal pain. The men would stand on the rocking deck or try rubbing their arms up and down to keep their eyes from slowly closing. How many times can you count the stars in the heavens above? A scream filled the air. It was the man on watch. He was pointing his finger at the side of the raft, trying to tell what he had just seen. He swore that a huge tentacle had just reached up from the ocean and snatched one of his fellow sailors. Lieutenant Gregory looked around and he saw only 7 men now. The watch must have dozed off. He was probably imagining seeing a sea monster. The man on watch swore he did not doze off. He said the tentacle was as big around as his body. To avoid any more late night excitement, the lieutenant put 2 men on watch. They could keep each other awake by doing something or other. In the darkness, Lieutenant Gregory awoke to intense pain in his leg. He looked and he saw a tentacle was wrapped around him, dragging his body towards the edge of the raft. Those suckers on a squid are not really suckers. They're a ring of teeth that bite in order to hang on to their prey. A squid has 8 arms and 2 tentacles, which are longer and more dexterous. Plus, they can shoot their tentacles out and retract them in the blink of an eye. His frantic yells brought the crew to his rescue. They used their knives to stab and slice at the huge limb, trying to get it to release their officer. The beast became perturbed by all the poking and stabbing and finally let go, slipping back into the water below. One of the men got busy trying to bandage the wounded leg with whatever they could find, probably somebody's shirt. Once more the sun came up and the sun went down. Instead of 2 men on watch, they all stayed awake, too terrified to sleep. They all sat in a circle in the middle of the raft, each man holding his knife. The tentacle didn't show back that night. As the men were growing more dazed and confused by the lack of food and sleep, one of them spotted smoke on the horizon. There was a ship, maybe more, heading their way. Waving and yelling is pretty much useless endeavor, but people are going to do that in such a situation. The oncoming convoy needs to be close enough for the lookouts to actually see the raft. You don't scan the water with binoculars. You look back and forth using your twin optical units until you see something of interest, and then you use the binoculars. One of the destroyer escorts came alongside in the raft, and the men had to be lifted up using ropes. They were all too weak from their ordeal. Once on board, the sailors received their first meal in a long time, some dry clothing, and a bunk to crash in. Do you sleep in or on a bunk? I guess it depends on how you're sleeping. One of the destroyer escorts, I just said that, didn't I? I got lost in my own notes. Need more coffee, that's the problem. Lieutenant Gregory was taken to the sick bay, patched up, and then allowed to sleep. Once on dry land, the lieutenant was ordered to the official inquiry board. What happened to their ship? And what happened on board that life raft? When the lieutenant told about the giant tentacle, the officers on the board all believed that he had spent too much time in the elements and was delusional. His huge round wound to his upper thigh was caused by some kind of debris he must have hit during the sinking. Never mind, all the other men told the same story. It had to have been mass hallucination. Or maybe one of the men had somehow convinced the others that they had been attacked by a giant squid. Lieutenant Gregory quickly realized that the Board of Inquiry didn't want to hear anything bizarre or unbelievable. They only wanted to hear him tell them what they wanted to hear. He was eventually sent back to the line and soon found himself on a new ship. None of the officers wanted to hear stories about sea monsters. As for the crew, they do tend to talk about some crazy things, things that just might be real. The HMS Defender was a British submarine that was attacked by a giant squid in the Straits of Malacca near the Indian Ocean in 1940. According to the report, crew members were on deck when an enormous squid emerged from the water, wrapped its tentacles around the submarine's hull, and began to squeeze. The sailors fought off the creature with axes and gunfire before it released its grip and disappeared back into the depth. In the lead up to World War II, Germany was extremely limited in their military abilities. The provisions of the Treaty of Versailles restricted the German Navy to 15,000 men, no submarines at all. The fleet was limited to 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats. Knowing war was coming, coming. No, I'm making up words. Use that in your next sentence. Hominy. Knowing war was coming, Germany began building huge cargo ships with high speed engines and armor plating that the Allies had no ideas of. The ships were designed for deck guns to be easily installed once the ship was out of sight. The Kriegsmarine Command allowed each captain to name their ship. There was the Penguin, the Comet, the Orion, and of course my favorite, the Atlantis. The auxiliary cruiser Thor, aka Merchant Raider, began her hunt in July 6, 1940, under the command of Captain Otto Kohler. She sailed south out of the Baltic Sea and made her way down the south central Atlantic, wreaking havoc off the coast of Africa and Brazil. During their hunt, the crew managed to sink 8 Allied ships, and they survived battles with 2 British armored merchant cruisers. The idea wasn't really to sink ships, but to try and capture them. All the supplies headed to the British ports should be headed to the German ports instead. March 25, 1941, the Thor encountered the British transport Britannia. The Britannia was a passenger liner first launched in 1921 and converted to a troop ship at the start of World War II. She had departed Liverpool, England on March 11th under the command of Captain Cawley, bound for Bombay, India. Britannia made a stopover in the port of Freetown, Sierra Leone, and then continued south. It was sailing right into the sights of the Thor. The Thor began firing at the Britannia, which was also armed with deck guns. The Thor was armored, so it deflected any small rounds, whereas the Britannia was just a passenger ship turned into military transport. Captain Coley told the radio man to send out a distress signal along with their position as many times as he could. The two vessels exchanged a whole bunch of rounds before Captain Coley realized that his ship was no longer seaworthy. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. He had the colors lowered and a white flag raised. The crew scrambled to launch the lifeboats and the life rafts before jumping over the rails into the sea below. Around 200 crewmen and 300 passengers huddled around the emergency craft and watched as the Thor was sent to the bottom. Correction, as the Thor sent their ship to the bottom. Even during wartime, sailors kind of look out for each other. The thing to do was for the merchant raider to take all the men from the water on deck, and the lifeboats and the rafts were to be towed, relocated closer to the coast, or taken in as prisoners of war. 500 men, that would have been a lot of POWs on board one auxiliary cruiser. Captain Rogue of the Atlantis was famous for rescuing any and all survivors during an attack. The Nazi overlords considered this a waste of time and resources, but many of the men actually doing the work still had morals and scruples. Now, there were atrocities, and there were also acts of kindness. The German raider recognized the Britannia's surrender and signaled that it would allow a few minutes of ceasefire to allow the crew members and passengers to abandon ship before delivering the coup de grace. Coup de grace is a French term meaning blow of mercy, referring to a final act that ends suffering, often used in contexts of mercy killings or as a metaphor for decisive action that concludes a situation. Or, as Bugs Bunny said, cut the grass. As the Britannia was lowering her lifeboats and dropping life rafts into the water, Captain Otto Collier found himself in a bit of a quandary. The decent thing to do was, once the Britannia was at the bottom, assist the survivors. The ship wasn't carrying any cargo, it was a troop ship. The vessel was so badly damaged it was no longer seaworthy. There were 500 men in the water. Radio messages were sent out over the airwaves so anyone could hear them. Codes were used to keep secrets secret. Any signal sent out was heard by everyone. The Thor's radio room picked up a signal from a British warship that seemed to be heading their way. Not wanting to go head to head with a far superiorly armed warship, Captain Kohler ordered the Thor to make way, leaving the survivors where they were. The British ship could rescue them in a few hours. As the Thor sailed away, many of the crew were somewhat upset at the idea of leaving the Britannia survivors in the water, where it was known to have lots of large sharks. The idea was if the Germans were the victims, the British would hopefully come to their aid. In Europe during the war, the German Luftwaffe ground crews would rush to the scene of any downed Allied airmen. They would actually rescue the airmen from hostile German soldiers and civilians. The Luftwaffe, hoping the airmen would let their folks back home know of their decent treatment, So any German airman who got shot down over England might be treated well as in the same way. People do get a bit upset when you drop bombs on them. Now, this wasn't always the case, but it was quite common. Kohler Kohler did have his radio man send out a coded message to Germany telling of the men in the water. He hoped that maybe this information might be rebroadcast in open language, but the folks in the rear with the gear don't have the same morals or scruples as the people doing the fighting. What the crew of the Thor didn't know was the message from the British warship was actually in regards to another sinking farther north. The men of the Britannia were not going to be rescued for several days. The men in the water watched as the Thor sailed away, and then they waited for rescue. It shouldn't be too long, just have to wait and wait and then wait some more. At least they weren't freezing like the men up north. The North Atlantic is far more hostile than the South Atlantic. Seaman Cox and Rowlandson and others all had little to do other than delve into their own minds. Cox and 11 other men were together on a small life raft, about 10 by 10. They would spend 5 days in the water before being rescued on March 29th by a Spanish ship, the Cabos de Hornos. Once back home, Cox told about their ordeal during the long nights. He was half asleep when something grabbed the man next to him and drug him over to the edge of the raft. It was a huge tentacle, as big around as his leg. The teeth around the sucker dug into the man's flesh, and he cried out for the others to save him, but he disappeared below the waves. The crew were all wide awake now, looking for any more danger, when the tentacle re-emerged. This time it grabbed Cox. As his life flashed before his eyes, the tentacle suddenly released its hold and went back under. Cox said he had no idea why, only he survived the same kind of an attack that the other man had died from. Cox was left with an incredible pain in his leg with no way of taking care of it. The men could only huddle together in the center of the raft and wait for daylight and hopeful rescue. Once Seaman Cox was taken aboard the Spanish ship, he was treated in the sick bay, where they found a ring of circular bites as big around as a plate. Each bite was the size of a large coin. The two stories sound so much alike, but one was in the North Atlantic and the other was south of the equator. Plus, the kinds of ships involved were different. One was one of the Liberty ships, and the other was a troop transport. But other than that, same creature, same kind of attack. The USS Stein was equipped with a brand new sonar unit that was mounted on the very bow just below the waterline. It was covered in a waterproofing material very similar to rubber, only a lot tougher. The system was checked for any problems, and then it was checked again because any small problem would be a huge problem once out at sea. In 1978, the ship went for a cruise to check out this new equipment. All was going well until it wasn't. The sonar suddenly began giving off really weird readings. It emitted a very loud noise, and then it quit. The problem was traced to the unit mounted on the bow, which could not be serviced at sea. The ship was forced to return to port for repairs. The destroyer was forced to return to dry dock in California to investigate and hopefully make any repairs needed. It didn't take long, once back in dry dock, to figure out why the sonar had stopped working. It turned out that the very massive sonar dome, located just below the waterline, was badly damaged. It looked at first as if the ship had collided with another ship, only they hadn't. A closer look showed the rubberized cover had been torn apart and the structure underneath was badly damaged. More than 8% of the dome's surface was found to have large tears in the rubber covering, as if it had been torn apart by something numerous and sharp, like running through a barbed wire fence. Some pieces were so badly torn that they hung in shreds, and the largest hole was 4 feet in diameter. This sounds like my cats had been involved. It seemed that something very large and powerful attacked the dome and tore it to shreds, and this was confirmed by the presence of several broken off, curved hooks or claws that were sunk deep into the rubber. As repairs progressed, these claws, whatever they were sent for analysis and study, including those examined by naval biologist F. G. Wood, who concluded they were squid tentacle hooks that had been part of a giant squid. These hook claws were so large that they were unknown to science. According to Wood, the length of the squid with such hooks would have to have been 150 feet long. That is, it would be absolute giant of the underwater world, a thing unknown to science. For comparison, the largest known squid being the genus Architeuthis, or giant squid's maximum length is said to be about 40 feet. The Mesencytethus, or the colossal squid, reaches about 60 feet in length, along with its tentacles. The giant squid has teeth ringing its suckers, and the colossal squid has hooks. If we take it for granted that an incredibly large squid attacked an American ship, then the recognition of this species could be the main scientific sensation of the century. But the boys in the white lab coats said, nay, nay, I didn't see it, so therefore I don't believe it. Particularly curious is the fact that giant squid of the genus those things, the colossal squid, live in the Antarctic Ocean, which is quite far from where the USS Stein was located. At the same time, some giants live at great depths, and usually they only come to the surface when they're sick or they've been caught on a fishing line. This supposedly injured or sick squid, for some reason, found the strength to aggressively attack a large ship, damaging its equipment. The new sonar equipment must have been tuned to just the right frequency to attract a colossal squid. The story of the USS Stein was widely publicized in cryptozoology and has since been seen as proof of the existence of some previously undiscovered species of very massive squids lurking in the deep parts of the world. But the scientists all decided this wasn't a giant squid, but something else. It couldn't be a squid because they only get up to 60 feet and not an inch bigger. They know this because, well, they have white lab coats and they spend their time sitting in laboratories looking through microscopes. Many squid are a few inches long, but giant and colossal squids can be enormous. The two types are estimated to grow from 40 to 60 feet in length, including body and tentacles. That's larger than a full length school bus. much bigger than the short bus. But we're not going to mention that. They can weigh up to 1,000 pounds and they have protruding eyes the size of volleyballs. Humboldt squid are the smallest of the three types. They only get to be 6 to 7 feet long and weigh about 100 pounds. They have been known to eat fishermen who fall in the water. They also eat each other. How do these marine animals get so big? The most common explanation is a phenomenon called deep sea gigantism. The theory suggests that over time, small, shallow water creatures evolve to live at vast deep sea levels by getting bigger, likely due to the combination of food supply and the increased size of predators down there. In shallow water, it's advantageous to stay small because there's limited food. At extreme depths where massive squid are thought to live, roughly 650 to 2,600 feet below the surface, bigger creatures have the size and endurance on their side when traveling long distances looking for something or someone to eat. When you're a small fish in a large pond, you're a snack. If you're the big fish, you get to choose who's the snack. 2003, a French yacht taking part in the Jules Verne round the world sailing competition was attacked by a giant squid in the mid-Atlantic. The word yacht is derived, okay, yacht. The word yacht is derived from the Dutch word jacht, meaning to hunt, and is spelled reflecting its historical evolution and phonetic changes over time. That's why yacht ends with a T and is pronounced throat warbler mangrove. I'll bet there are a few of you that missed that reference. Raymond Luxury Yacht, which is pronounced throat warbler mangrove, is a fictional character from the TV show Monty Python's Flying Circus, portrayed by Graham Chapman. Raymond appears in the second series episode, It's a Living and How to Recognize Different Parts of the Body. If you're not a Python fan, you should be. You can find most of their skits on YouTube. Rumble also has some of their stuff. If you're growing tired of all the censoring, check out Rumble instead. I think I'm on the one black mark away from being banned on YouTube. They keep telling me I'm not a doctor. I can't say certain things. Strange Things is on Rumble, only it's called Chris James 42, all run together. It started out being named Strange Things with Chris James, only something went wrong. As I was trying to straighten out some mistake I'd made, I wound up accidentally creating a new account without even noticing. That's kind of how I do things anyway. It had something to do with logging in and trying to undo some mistake, which turned into a bigger mistake. And finally, I just decided I'm just going to leave it there. If the problems in the world were hung from a tree, we'd all pick our own. My dad used to say that all the time, and I always thought he was being very eloquent and philosophical. I had no idea that Martin Luther had actually said it first, and my dad was just quoting him. You do know that you cannot unquote something at the end. Once you quote someone, you can't unquote them. You say end quote. The folks trying to sound intelligent fall short in this department, quote unquote. Uh, they also say that anyone who quotes other people all the time never has any thoughts of their own. Veteran yachtsman, veteran yachtsman Oliver Kersausen was at the helm of the trimaran Geronimo when the boat was hit by strange vibrations. He sent a crew member below decks to try to identify what was wrong. Looking through a viewing port by the rudder, the crewmen saw something moving, wrapped around the rudder. It turned out to be a bunch of tentacles. A giant squid was holding on to the rudder, pulling really hard, twisting back and forth as if it was trying to yank the rudder loose. The captain ordered the yacht to slow down so they could see what was going on better. As soon as the boat began to slow, the squid released its hold and then swam away from the boat, surfacing a short ways away. The crew all saw this enormous beast right behind their boat. Crew member Dieter Regault, who was the one that spotted the creature through the porthole, said the tentacle was as big around as my arm. I immediately thought what damage that creature could have done. As the creature was on the surface, the crew saw it and estimated it to be at least 30 feet long. There's a very good reason I don't go in the deep water. I refuse to take a cruise. I'm not into scuba diving or swimming in the ocean. If I can't see the bottom, I don't really like it. There are things out there, big things that see us as tasty little snacks. The 150-foot squid, the megalodon, the killer whale, sea monsters, the white coated crowd are all trying to convince us aren't real. Okay, the killer whale is real, and anything with the name killer in its name is to be avoided. One night, way back in 1981, God, that's a long time ago. It's hard to imagine how long ago that was. One night back in 1981, I was invited, along with a group of other people, to go sailing on board the Snoopy, a sailing boat that was owned by a guy I knew. I didn't realize that the trip was going to take place at night. I arrived early to help out any way I could, not knowing the stem from the stern. Okay, I know the stem from the stern. The front of the boat and the back of the boat. Anyway, I arrived early to kind of help out, and then I waited, and I waited, and I waited. As we began to sail out of Clear Lake into Galveston Bay, I discovered that we were now in the dark, out in a huge body of water with no idea what might be lurking below. There was coffee, but there was also a lot of water, a whole lot of water, and a whole lot of darkness around us. Eventually, we couldn't see the lights of the shore in any direction. The coffee didn't help. We stayed out way too long. I don't remember much of the trip other than my imagination was having a festival, thinking up all the bad things that might happen. Had it not been so dark, the captain would have probably thought I was seasick. I was somewhat pale and shaking. I have taken the Bolivar Ferry a few times in the daytime, surrounded by other people who hopefully will look more tasty to monsters in the water. I don't consider this to be a phobia, like a very good idea. Sharks can't eat you if you're sitting at home on the couch. And now for something completely different. I used to know a couple of guys who tended to step over the line from time to time. This was back in the late 1970s, early 80s. They were in Bolivar and they'd gotten hold of a book of tickets. They walked up and down the line of cars waiting for the ferry. Any out of state plates were sold a ticket for $2 to get on board the ferry. They were told they needed the ticket. These two guys worked the line just long enough for the first ferry to reach Galveston before getting the heck out of there. The Bolivar Ferry is free. It's part of the Texas highway system, and it's paid for with our taxes. I believe there is now a sign on the side of the road telling people that the ferry is free and that they don't have to pay for it. Yeah, I think it's because of those two guys. If you enjoyed tonight's show, if you did, spread it around. Let other people know they should be watching Strange Things with Chris James. Or you can watch Cow and Chicken, which is on YouTube also. Weird cartoons I used to watch, even not that long ago. Cow and Chicken, Ren and Stimpy, uh, things like that. Back when cartoons were still fun and educational. Until next time, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where there's strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.